Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another social studies mini lesson. Last time we looked at World War I, and we looked at all these different countries who were fighting, who really shouldn't have been fighting. We are going to now pick up with what happens after the war, a time period called the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this lesson, it's this lesson that people learned in the 1920s. It is,
don't spend money that you don't have.
There you go. So after the war, all of our soldiers came home. There was a rise in manufacturing. People had jobs, so they were able to buy more in general. Now there were some people who were not so well off. Farmers really suffered. We're going to talk about them more in the next video. But a lot of the people coming back were a little better educated, and they were working in manufacturing and things like that. And they saw stuff, all this new technology that had come out over the last few years started to really get popular. And they saw a lot of things they wanted, and at least temporarily, they thought they had the money to buy. So the Roaring Twenties, it was called the Roaring Twenties because it was kind of a loud, boisterous time. It was a time to party. Women started cutting their hair, and there were all new styles of clothes. The style was called flappers. Go figure. But so these women were wanting all new clothes, and they had a lot of freedom. Women got the right to vote in the 1920s. So that was our 19th Amendment. So you had a lot of these women who were they were free to vote. They could have some kind of jobs, a lot of them. They were making names for themselves, and they were wearing all these new fashion. Well, guess what? Some people could afford to do that. Some people had to borrow money to do that. And they had to learn the hard way.
Don't spend money that you don't have.
So fashion was one of the areas where people borrowed money to try to fit in. All right? Radios had been used a little bit before the war, but the first radio stations came about in the 1920s. And so everybody wanted a radio in their house. It was the new novelty. It was like having the biggest, best flat screen TV. So they wanted these radios, and some people could afford them, but some people had to buy them on credit. Remember that lesson on debit versus credit? The credit card is where you borrow money to pay for something else. That's what they did. They borrowed money. They bought this radio on credit. And they had some of the new technology like the radios. People were buying when they didn't have the money, and they had to learn a hard lesson.
Don't spend money that you don't have.
Cars were another example of technology. All these manufacturers who were making tanks and Jeeps during the war, well, they switched to making cars afterwards, and cars were pretty affordable, but there were lots of people who wanted one that didn't necessarily need to have one or couldn't afford one, so they bought it on credit. They bought a car and made a little down payment and then promised to pay so much each month until it was paid off, along with the interest, that little bit of extra. And many of them got in trouble because they didn't follow this lesson.
What is it?
Don't spend money you don't have.
Don't spend money you don't have.
There you go. All right. Another thing that happened in the 1920s, we had several things that went on there. Jazz was part of the Harlem Renaissance. Jazz is a type of music. Basically, here's what happened in the Harlem Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. In Harlem, which is in New York City, it's part of New York City, you had a lot of African Americans living there, and many of them were starting to become musicians and writers. And so you had a lot of art coming out, especially African American art. So that's called the Harlem Renaissance. And people were going to parties and they were going to clubs to hear this new jazz music. And they were buying these books. And some of them couldn't afford to do that. They were borrowing money to do that. So they didn't learn the lesson of
don't spend money that you don't have.
There you go. Something else that happened in the 1920s, the 18th Amendment passed. That was prohibiting or outlawing the sale of alcoholic drinks. That didn't stop people from drinking. They just had to pay a lot more and be sneaky in how they did it. So again, people were partying and they didn't follow the rule.
Don't spend money that you don't have.
All right. A final way that they didn't really learn this lesson, the stock market became big. That's where you take some of your money and you loan it to a company so that they have money to make things, and then they pay you back with interest. That's that extra. So you can actually make money by investing in another company. Your parents may have retirement funds that where they have stocks or they've invested in the stock market. And right now they're looking at it going, because here in the last few weeks, the stock market hasn't done so good. And that's fine. If you have all your bills paid and you have food on the table and a roof over your head, and then you take what's left, the extra, to invest in the stock market, it still hurts when you lose it, but it doesn't hurt as bad. These people, there were people who actually borrowed money to put into the stock market thinking they would get that money back and pay it back, and they get to keep the extra. They spent the money they didn't have, and when the stock market crashed in October of 1929 and everybody lost a huge amount of money, they lost any chance of making money, and they lost all the money they owed because they didn't follow a simple rule.
Don't spend money that you don't have.
Okay, so I don't expect you to remember all the facts and things about the 1920s, but I want you to understand that the 1920s set the country up for an economic disaster that we're going to talk about in the next video, and that is called the Great Depression. And it was all because people were spending money they didn't have. They were buying all kinds of stuff they didn't need, and it ended up getting them in a lot of trouble because they couldn't pay their debt. Now, let me be clear. I'm not talking about going into debt like today because you can't pay your bills because of what's going on right now. Everybody's at home. Some people are out of work. I'm not talking about going into debt because of medical bills or other necessities. I'm talking about going into debt over things you don't need. Okay? So when it comes to things you don't need, like the newest iPhone or the best TV or the biggest game station, follow this simple rule.
Don't spend money that you don't have.
That's the one big takeaway from this lesson. Learn from the people of the 1920s. Don't make their mistakes. So there you go. There's our little mini lesson on the 1920s and how they partied and bought, and they got in a lot of trouble in the end. So if you want to look up a little bit more about the 1920s, you can look up women's suffrage. That's the ability to vote. You can look up prohibition. That's where you can't sell alcohol. You can also do a little bit of research on Black Tuesday, October 1929, when the stocks crashed. That's where we're going to pick up on our next video. So stay safe, have fun, keep sending me jokes, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.